Welcome to Module 3. In this module, we're going to cover a number of different topics through our 4 lectures, from gamification and digital game-based learning to badges and even the use of augmented reality and QR codes in education. But let's first talk about how digital game-based learning has evolved in education and how we might be able to implement very simple and easy game-based approaches in our classes, and how we might even want to take advantage of some of the great games available on mobile devices and on computers, and even game environments where students can build their own games to help implement our lessons in virtual settings. So as teachers, we've been using games for a long time. Particularly in our face-to-face classes, we'll have students use games as a method to build social skills, team skills, add a little bit of competition to our classes to motivate perhaps students to be more engaged in their activities, to develop skills that maybe are real-world skills or discipline-specific skills that will make students successful once they're out of our classes, and to even just have a little bit of fun, which is really important actually in learning. So since we've been using games, another revolution has happened, and this is the video game revolution. Now in 1974, Atari introduced Pong, one of the first video games available, and this opened up the world for not only having a lot of fun through these video games, but also to provide learning opportunities through these games, from simulations to challenging competitive activities where students can build those same skills that we were talking about and work with our topics in the same way as we have in the physical setting in our face-to-face classes. So how do we marry these two? How do we take what we know about games and gamification in our face-to-face classes and marry that with all of the opportunities that digitizing games and the internet provides us? Well, let's first start by understanding gamification and digital game-based learning. Gamification is where you take game-like principles and you apply them to other settings or non-traditional game settings like business and like education. We see this in our everyday lives quite often around us, whether it's an activity that we're doing, it's a social activity that we are granted badges from, or we have levels, through to a lot of the games that we play, even on our mobile devices like Angry Birds and other things. Well, how do we take some of those opportunities and apply them to our virtual classes? Well, we can think about gamifying things to start with. And gamifying means implementing, as I said, those game-based principles in an education or a learning setting. So we can take points and associate them with particular activities, and students can build points up and be ranked and see how they're doing compared to other students on leaderboards. They can level through work as they progress through easier to harder concepts. They can even receive badges as they work through those easier to harder concepts, or even after they've completed a particular set of activities or activity that we've asked them to do. So by implementing these things, not only can we gamify it, make it a little more fun for students, engaging, motivating, and hopefully a better way for them to develop skills, but we can also adapt their learning experiences. So adaptive learning is where students are working through activities, and as they work through those activities, the response systems, oftentimes it's a teacher responding, or the particular lesson strategy is responding, but those response systems come back and help students fill in the gaps where they miss ideas or concepts based on various progressions through those activities. So it's a way to progress students as they're progressing in their own evolution of concepts. And true adaptive learning is where it not only gates students, but it helps them fill in those gaps, as I mentioned, as they're learning. Well, some really good games out there can actually do this, where it becomes fun and challenging for students and engaging, and it's also understanding where the students' strengths and weaknesses lie and helping them to build on those so that they can successfully complete the activities and build the skills we're hoping them to do. So gamifying gives us the opportunity to implement all of these different game strategies in our lessons and in our classes. Now, the cool thing about gamification is that it marries really nicely with a lot of the learning theories that we've been talking about throughout the duration of this course and that I'm sure you already are implementing in your classes. Games are very active. They often are about solving problems or challenges in particular contexts or settings. They can be very social, whether it's through leaderboards and rankings or whether it's because you're having students complete team games or do things in groups. And games can be very constructivist. They don't always have to have very clear and set paths that students work through. They can be very open for students to develop their own paths and build on their own creativity as they're working through a particular challenge or working to build a particular skill. And finally, games can be incredibly collaborative. Once again, whether you're having students do them in teams or whether you're having students just challenge one another individually, the work that they can produce, the learning that they can participate in can be very collaborative through the use of games and gamification. So Mark Prensky is one of the pioneers in the digital game-based learning environment. And he's written a number of books, particularly his first book, Digital Game-Based Learning, is a great read if you haven't ever read any of his work and are thinking about really looking for new strategies to gamify or to implement digital game-based learning. But I think it's important for us to understand what he says about digital learning games. As you can see here, he says that it's not just about engaging, but it's also about introducing fun into the learning experience. And by introducing fun, you can bring in then serious learning and interactive entertainment into this digital medium and do far better in helping students develop the skills and the knowledge necessarily to be successful out of our classes than some of our more traditional methods. Now, there still is a debate out in the community of how effective can digital game-based learning really be, and is it better than other models of teaching and learning? But there is quite a bit of research, and Mark Prensky addresses a fair amount of that in his writings about how digital game-based learning can be as effective as other strategies in our classes. So let's talk about what we mean by digital game-based learning. Digital game-based learning can take the form of all sorts of different shapes and sizes. In this case, this is SimCity EDU. SimCity has been a popular video game for over 15 years, I believe, and it just recently announced that it would be releasing an education edition where the lessons or the building of these simulated cities is focused on STEM education. So that's a great way to bring in students into creating a very open-ended world for themselves in a very active and fun game that takes all of those gamification premises and implements them, and at the same time helping students build their own knowledge in the STEM sciences. So it could be math knowledge, science knowledge, and some of those other physical sciences and biological sciences areas. So it's a great example of using a game. So let's talk about what the strengths of using that kind of game in your classes would be. One of the nice things about those kinds of digital games is they promote a lot of interactivity. And they're engaging. You're constantly doing and presented with new things. You're challenged very quickly and very often. There's no one task that you're stuck on for more than 5, 10, maybe even 3 minutes at a time. And you're able to be recognized and get instant rewards or instant feedback on how well you're doing as you're building your city, as in SimCity, or as you're interacting with one of those digital games. It also fosters a lot of creativity. A lot of the digital games that we can utilize or the gamification strategies we can apply to our classes start with what I like to call blank page creation, right? Students aren't given anything to build off of. They need to start from scratch. And that can encourage creativity and once again can also develop those critical problem solving and critical thinking skills that we want our students to develop. And finally, games can also present students with opportunities or scenarios or simulations where they can develop actually the very specific skills that they need to go do a task. A very classic one, although not an education one necessarily, is learning how to fly. There's a lot of flight simulators out there that future pilots and astronauts work with on end before they actually go into the live plane. Well, in education spaces, you can see simulations around dissecting frogs, how a heart or an eye works, all sorts of scenarios and simulations. You can do various lab experiments digitally. All of those can help build those exact skills that you would want your students to develop that perhaps they can't because they're not in a physical face-to-face setting, and they're learning through virtual education. Now, some of the challenges. So let's think back to that Sim City, right? We're building our own city and we're focusing on some of the physical and biological sciences behind building and managing a city. Well, there's some challenges inherent in using games like that. One of them is just finding good games at little or no cost. So one of the challenges about that SimCity EDU example I've been sharing is that it is for cost. There isn't a free version yet, although there are some grant opportunities for schools to apply to be able to use that game in their classes. There is some cost. So it's often hard to find good games. You need good recommendations and good peer communities to find good games or good game-based applications that you can use at little or no cost. There's also usually quite a bit of time involved in not only creating your own game, if you want to set up your own game digitally, but then also in building out a particular game or a lesson around a game that's already existing. So to have students go in and play SimCity EDU isn't enough. You would want to create structure around that and lesson activities and perhaps even phases that you would want to have students work through. And doing that can take quite a bit of time. So digital game-based learning and even gamification does have a time challenge and sometimes even a resource challenge behind it. There's also a challenge in how much game time is actually needed to progress through the particular activity or work. In some cases, it could be just easier to have students, I hate to say this, but listen to a presentation or work through a worksheet. Now, we all know we don't want to do those kinds of things because they aren't as engaging and motivating, and there's lots of research that's told us that they aren't necessarily as effective as other strategies, but they can move quickly. Whereas sometimes in order for a student to build the skills or the knowledge that you need them to through using games, it can actually take more time. But that's one of the fun things about games is a lot of times students are motivated to do them and they're willing to put in a lot more time because it's fun and it's interesting and they can see that their work immediately and can get feedback very quickly in those game environments. And then finally, as I mentioned before, there can be resource challenges, both physical and virtual. Making sure students have the devices and the internet access, making sure that students have the understanding of how to use those games and aren't distracted by the games. Making sure that students have all of the necessary instructions and information needed in order to be effective in the games. All of that requires resources, both physical and virtual resources. And we can be limited in those, and that can challenge us in how we might want to implement games or gamify our learning opportunities. And then finally, there can be challenges around external support. There's still folks in the education community that aren't completely bought into the use of games, especially some of the popular games that students may play for fun used in the class. There are challenges around that. Parents and schools and districts may not be as supportive of the use of games because they may just see it as play, and they may not understand the real value to the learning experience and ultimately to the student in using those games. So knowing how and when to share with your community, your education community particularly, why games are effective, share with them the research that shows that, and how you're using those particular games in your learning opportunities will become important to combat that perhaps external support challenge. Now that we've thought about just sort of the evolution of games and gamification in education, let's take a step back and think about a situation where we might want to apply gamification. So I teach science to children ages 10 through 12 in a hybrid setting. So I do get to see them in some face-to-face classes, and then others they're doing virtual work. Well, I have a series of lessons that's focused on the major scientific discoveries of the 20th and 21st centuries. And I want to gamify this. I want students to try to uncover and experience the value of these major scientific discoveries to their lives. And I think I can create a game or gamify my approach focused on these lessons. What would you say some advantages are for me doing this? What would be some of the challenges that I might face in trying to gamify this particular series of lessons? So while you think about that, you can prepare for our next lectures, which are going to talk about examples of games that you can use, of applications that you can use, and even some your own do-it-yourself scenarios that you can use to gamify your learning opportunities.